Hey everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final video for Chapter 16, where we'll be discussing the influence India had in Southeast Asia. Now, first, focusing on some aspects in Southeast Asia, you can see, remember we talked about this a couple of videos ago about India's place in the whole trade network, kind of right smack dab in the middle. So Indian merchants, they traveled through Southeast Asia well into the BCE centuries. There's evidence to show as early as 500 BCE of merchants from India traveling around Sumatra and Borneo and places like that. Because the Southeast Asian spice trade was always big. That was always big money well before Europeans wanted to get their hands on it. Merchants in India and China and the Middle East and so forth, they wanted those spices from Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asian elites, they became very influenced by Indian political and cultural traditions. It's very similar to what we talked about in the previous chapter with China. The way that Korea, Vietnam, and Japan was very heavily influenced by China, you saw an awful lot of influence in Southeast Asia from India, right? So this area up here was more Chinese dominance. This area down here was more Indian dominance. And you see this in two aspects of it. One was in the Southeast Asian tradition of monarchies. You had very strong regional kings that fashioned themselves after the Rajas of India, and also religion. Where you have Hinduism and Buddhism in particular. Islam would come later. We'll talk about that on the next in a couple slides. But Hinduism and Buddhism, obviously, they come directly from India. Now, a couple of these early kingdoms that we talk about. The first one, Funan. You can see that one up here. Whoops. Let's go back. Not sure why the pen didn't work there. Try that one more time. All right. In any event, not sure why that's not working, but okay, you can see up here, kind of in the more brown shaded area, Funan. This was in the Mekong River Valley. You see the Mekong River runs today kind of along the border of Vietnam and Cambodia. And they controlled the trade routes, as they would come down through the South China Sea. They adopted an awful lot of Indian customs. They started calling their kings Raja, and they began worshiping Hindu gods. You also see the Srivijaya Empire, and you see the Strait of Malacca. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Very, very important waterway as you're coming from the South China Sea into the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. So controlling this is going to mean big money for them. So Srivijaya, they decided that they weren't going to focus on agriculture the way that Funan was. Funan did control trade rights, but you can see it still was a little bit more of a land-based one. Whereas the Srivijaya one, they only controlled coastlines, and they put all of their resources into their navy. They were just going to control the trade routes. But it was very successful for them. It brought them an awful lot of wealth and money. Some later ones, the main one to focus on here is this one, Angkor. That was control of, again, what today is mostly Vietnam and Cambodia. A little bit down onto the My Lai Peninsula, what was the old Funan Kingdom. It was also referred to as the Khmer Kingdom as well. That would be a term that in the 20th century, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, be a very, very, horrible regime that committed many atrocities. But they would build these huge temples and palaces in the Hindu tradition. You see some other smaller ones, but the Angkor one is kind of really the only one that we need to focus on. But a prime example of the Indian influence is the famous temples at Angkor Wat. You can see very much influenced by the Hindu tradition of kind of the pointy dome tops to it. And these were kind of left out for the, basically taken over by the jungle for centuries until they were rediscovered by Europeans, much, much later. But they built these really kind of fantastic Hindu temples and, kind of for worshiping the different gods. And obviously still around to this day. They're not really used for religious purposes so much, but more just for tourist attractions. Now, Islam in Southeast Asia. Islam reached Southeast Asia the same way that it reached India, and that's through merchants. As I said, the spice trade in Southeast Asia was big bucks, and that meant money for Arab traders also. So merchants from the Middle East, they brought Islam to Southeast Asia, and they took hold in trade states like Malacca. I showed you guys that Strait of Malacca before. Here you see a little bit kind of more detail in between, what today would be Malaysia and then down in, Singapore and Indonesia. this was a very, very important waterway, as I said, coming from the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean. And the wealthy elites, they decided to adopt to Islam in the 15th century. And once they did that, they really established it as, having a foothold in Southeast Asia. And it would continue to expand into the current day. Indonesia today has the largest Muslim population of any country in the world. We think of the Middle East as being those type of countries. And yes, they are overwhelmingly Muslim, but they don't have quite as many people as Indonesia. So Islam today is more dominant than Hinduism or Buddhism even. All right, so that kind of wraps it up. Again, another quick one, and that kind of wraps things up for chapter 16. And so hopefully we got something out of this and learned a bit on classical India.